Galaxy 666 by Pel Torro. Session 1.
Welcome, everyone, to the start of an incredible journey. A journey that will take you to places you never dreamed could exist. A journey to the edge of reason and sanity. A journey into Pel Torro's seminal 1963 pulp science fiction classic,
Galaxy 666.
which is arguably the worst novel ever published. But before we start our journey, let's make sure we all know what we're getting into. So let me begin with a word to all our Christian fundamentalist friends out there. No. Despite the numerical affiliation with the beast, and I'm saying that with quotation marks around it, there's nothing about Satan or Satanism in the book. Indeed, there are few if any swear words, no sex or any other signs of amorous intent, and virtually no violence, or really any action. Pel has delivered the ultimate G-rated, family-friendly sci-fi novel, probably not wholly by accident. Let me now introduce you to our host and author, Pel Torro. Yes, Lionel Fanthorpe used the nom de plume of Pel Torro when he wrote Galaxy 666, as well as using it for other titles, but I would argue that we should distinguish between the author and the writer. As books are created at a distinct moment in time, and are constructed from a combination of the writer's personal history and creativity up to that defining moment, the writer, as the book's author, becomes forever tied to that book, becomes a part of that book, while the writer continues to write, to grow, to evolve, to live. In the case of Galaxy 666, on the one hand you have the writer, Lionel Fanthorpe. He is a real person, alive and well today and living in Wales, and I encourage you to visit his website, lionelfanthorpe.com. He is an ordained Anglican minister, former school headmaster, member of Mensa, experienced practitioner of judo, has written over 240 books, appeared on radio and talk shows, hosted his own television show, and is the devoted husband of his wife and partner of over 50 years, Patricia. It is through his kind permission and that of the good people at Orion Publishing that I'm able to do this podcast at all. On the other hand, you have the author, Pel Torro, who is the Lionel Fanthorpe of 1963, frozen, as it were, in time. Galaxy 666 is not only a combination of what Lionel Fanthorpe was capable of writing at the age of 28, his first novel was published at the age of 19, but also the conditions under which the book had to be written. Pel Torro was one of several names Lionel wrote under while working with the publisher John Spencer & Company Limited, under the Badger imprint, and Galaxy 666 was influenced just as much by Badger as it was by Pel. John Spencer & Company was a prolific and notoriously cheap publisher of pulp fiction. The phrase pulp fiction comes from the extremely low-quality pulpy paper that Badger and other publishers like it used to print their books. On the positive side, because they were inexpensive, more people had access to them. Pulp fiction catered to the masses that could not afford the more expensive books. The plots were often simple, as were the characters. The Badger publisher favored quantity over quality, and kept a stable of writers gainfully employed producing as many books as they could in the shortest time possible, almost always at the expense of prose, clarity, and even spelling. The way John Spencer & Company worked was to send out cover art to its writers requesting appropriate titles, cover blurbs, and copy introductions. The publisher then chose which ones they wanted, apparently at random and with disregard for which cover art they were submitted for, and left it to the author to try to piece it all together as they wrote the novel. Which is how, in the case of Galaxy 666, we end up with a book cover illustration of a strange man fixing a launching rocket with a mesmeric stare, a book title of Galaxy 666, and a cover blurb of Man or Alien, which would claim the planet. Immediately, we have the question of whether we are dealing with a planet or a galaxy, and we should not expect the curious staring stranger to show up in the story at all. John Spencer & Company Limited, as it is with most purveyors of cheap production, demanded much for little compensation. Writers for the Badger publishers were usually given less than a week, sometimes only 8 to 12 hours, to produce a 45,000-word novel. Badger books had a standard length of about 158 pages as well, and the authors were compensated for their pains at only about 75 cents per 1,000 words. So a completed novel only brought in about $40, certainly not enough to live on. A Badger writer, assuming they had no family fortune to draw from, would also have another job, which would consume the regular work week. As such, these novels were often written in off hours, late at night, when fatigue and confusion had begun to settle in quite strongly. As a means of comparison, I would recommend a reading of one of Lionel Fanthorpe's later works, The Black Lion, the first of his Darrow trilogy, in which he expended over 7 years in the writing. Keep in mind, however, again, that the Lionel Fanthorpe that wrote The Black Lion was not the same Lionel Fanthorpe who wrote Galaxy 666. Mr. Fanthorpe's technique of writing stories consisted of dictating them into a tape recorder and then having the tapes transcribed by typists. With short timelines involved, manuscripts rarely, if ever, had second drafts. And editing takes time and money as well, neither of which John Spencer and Company had any desire to part with. Given these conditions, word count, page count, no sleep, one draft, no editing, what do we expect to find waiting for us, lurking between the pages of a Badger pulp fiction novel? I think I may safely say we have quite an adventure ahead of us. And certainly we may imagine that this confluence of detriment could eventually come together to create what some have labeled the worst novel ever published. Which begs a fair question. If Galaxy 666 is the worst novel ever published, why should you listen to a podcast of it? Or indeed, why should anyone wish to create one? Let's start with the hyperbole of worst novel ever published. Honestly, given the millions of published stories, who could ever claim to have such a comprehensive knowledge as to be able to identify the worst? And how can such a label be anything but subjective? Let me then attempt to persuade you with my criteria for what makes a good book. Books have one function and one function only: to make life richer. They may do this by educating, clarifying, reporting, entertaining, or any other means, but the life of the reader, in the opinion of the reader, should be better off for having encountered it. And I can report, my fellow travelers, that my interaction with Pel Torro and Galaxy 666 has made my life better. I have read this novel out loud to my family and friends, and even to guests at parties and dinners. I have fond memories of my children and I reading it and laughing over it at bedtime. Galaxy 666 is bad in some of the best possible ways, which was not wholly unintentional on the part of its author, and reading and sharing it has made my life richer. And that is why I am doing this podcast, in hope of making your life better as well. It is a book written in the blink of an eye on pulpy paper, and perhaps not due, ever, to be reprinted or preserved. But I did not want to see it disappear, never to be heard of again. Thankfully, you can find a copy of it online at sfgateway.com from Orion Publishing, and I encourage you to get it and read it for yourself, as well as following along with the podcast. When you read it for yourself, you will find many unique challenges that don't necessarily convey in an audio podcast. For instance, trying to determine which character is speaking at any given point. So here then is our plan. Over a span of 35 weeks, I will be publishing a pair of sessions released together each Friday, starting October 31st, 2014. The even-numbered sessions will be just the story, read as faithfully as I can. The odd-numbered sessions will be my time to share with you my favorite moments from the section just read, as well as discussing a bit more about pulp fiction, Badger, Pel, and Mr. Fanthorpe. Therefore, if you have no need of my rants, or you just wish to hear the story, you can simply listen to the even-numbered tracks. Each session will only be about 5 to 10 minutes in length, for, as Neil Gaiman once observed, don't read too much Lionel Fanthorpe at one go, or your brains will turn to guacamole and drip out your ears. Sound like fun? A trip into the worst novel ever written. Do you have the mettle to survive a journey to the heart of literary darkness? If so, meet back here on Friday, October 31st, and I, your humble guide, Toog, will take you on an adventure through
Galaxy 666.
Here ends Session 1.